So in the previous episode, we had to make some repairs to the input shaft on the CVT drive system that we're using on our 670cc Predator-powered Renault. Now, since the engine and drive system are already out of the car, now would be a great time to fabricate a new exhaust system to replace the very restrictive exhaust that came with the engine. And since we're motivated to do stuff, let's also remove the governor from this engine to sharpen up the throttle response. Now let's go over some feedback that I got from the last video where we repaired the input shaft. Now, some of you folks were saying I should add another support bearing to help eliminate flex in the drive line, and that's a great idea, so we're going to do that as well. But first, let's have a look at the exhaust. So this huge muffler that came with this engine is probably fine for most applications as long as the engine's not been modified. But keep in mind, any modifications to this engine absolutely have to begin with getting rid of this muffler. Now this is interesting. This muffler is so big and restrictive, the engine has to be specially tuned in order for it to run efficiently with this muffler. Now, of course, the size of the jets in the carburetor have to be correctly sized for the muffler, but on this engine, they took it one step further, and each side of this stock 2-barrel carburetor is tuned differently, and that translates to the jets on each side of the carburetor are different. And from what I can gather, it has something to do with the internal baffles inside the muffler. It's crazy, but in order for them to get this engine to run decent with this muffler, they had to tune each side of the carburetor differently. Now this carburetor will eventually be replaced with something more interesting, but for now we're going to keep it. And in order to get the engine to run properly with the new exhaust, we'll have to modify the jets, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So this being a V-twin engine, I went over to the Harley-Davidson forums and did some research. Apparently, a 2-into-1 exhaust system offers the best performance for the V-twin Harley engine, so that's what we're going to fabricate for this V-twin Predator engine. Now, of course, equal length header pipes would be ideal, but due to the difficulty of fabricating equal length headers, well, that ain't going to happen on this build. Our goal is simple, and all we need to do is to get both pipes to merge into a collector, and from that point the exhaust will exit the vehicle in a single pipe. Some of you folks may be disappointed that we're not going to run twin exhaust pipes for that iconic raw V-twin sound, but there's another reason we're going to fabricate a 2-into-1 exhaust, and that is so we can put a wideband sensor in the collector so we can measure the air-fuel ratio, and that will allow us to tune the stock carburetor and whatever carburetor we decide to use in the future. So let's take a quick look at the raw material that we're going to use to make the exhaust system on this engine. I kinda cheated, and off camera I worked out the details, well, because it makes me look smarter. Now, this exhaust ain't gonna be perfect as far as maximizing every ounce of power this engine can produce. Nope, it's gonna be a compromise. But it'll be heaps better than the garbage can type muffler that the engine came with. Now this, and these came with an El Cheapo do-it-yourself header kit that I got on the Jungle site for 39 bucks. Here, let's take a better look. Yeah, these are the basic components that I used, and it's a decent value for the money. For the collector, well, we're going to use this thing, and believe it or not, it's better than anything I can build. If you're wondering, it's a fancy exhaust tip that you can put on a crummy little car to make it look cooler, I guess. It's nearly the perfect size for what we need, and they did an excellent job blending all 3 pipes together. The only issue is, the 1.25" primary pipe doesn't exactly fit precisely, so I machined up a set of bushings to fill in the gap. Now these bushings are actually shaft collars, and to open up the centers, well, I chucked them in the lathe and bored them out for a perfect fit. Anyway, all these parts have been measured and cut to the exact length we need, so let's take a look at how they all fit together. Fast forward a bit and we have the exhaust loosely assembled on the engine. We're going to have to weld this in stages to ensure a perfect fit. Oh yeah, don't worry, once the exhaust is fully welded, it'll get wrapped to help reduce the temperatures in the engine bay. The first 2 things that need to be welded are the flanges to the head pipes, and that'll make it a lot easier to get everything lined up for final welding. Fast forward a bit, and the flanges are welded to the head pipes. Now, to be clear, I actually removed these pipes and welded them off the engine, and I also welded these bushings from the backside onto the head pipes. For the next few welds that we need to do, we need to have the exhaust assembled on the engine, and that guarantees a perfect fit. Now at this point, there's still plenty of wiggle room to get everything to line up correctly. Alright, let's put the final tack welds on this setup. Now that everything's been tack welded in place, I can take the exhaust off the engine and fully weld all the bits. This should be fun. Fast forward a few minutes and the exhaust is completely welded and painted. Now I still have to weld in a bung for the wideband sensor. However, I needed to fit the exhaust to the engine to determine the best location on the collector for the sensor. Anyway, I'll do that off camera. Now right here I'm using a simple splice clamp to attach the tailpipe. This gives me a lot of options for additional modifications in the future. I reckon since we completed the majority of the exhaust system, it's time to move on and have a look at removing the governor. In order to gain access to the governor, we're going to have to open up the engine, and that means we need to drain the oil. It's a shame this oil only has about 100 miles on it, but perhaps it's a good time to get rid of the break-in oil, so I guess this is a good thing. The governor on an engine like this is a simple mechanical feedback device that holds the engine at a set RPM range. The reason we're removing it is to get a faster throttle response. The governor can be a bit slow to react to throttle inputs, and this should help out quite a bit. Now, contrary to popular belief, removing the governor doesn't increase engine power. It only lets the engine rev higher, and in a lot of cases, removing the governor will also increase the risk of damaging the engine. So as you can see, the throttle connects through a series of linkages to a shaft that goes inside the engine. So we'll need to open up the engine and remove a few bits in order to disable the governor. So let's zip off a few bolts and remove the side cover on this engine. Now if you're careful, a lot of the time the side cover gasket can be salvaged and reused. However, as a precaution, I already purchased a new gasket and have it on hand in case I damage this gasket. And it looks like I did damage the gasket, so it's a good thing I have a brand new gasket sitting in a box just waiting to be installed. So here's the governor gear thingy. Here, let me show you how it works. So when this thingy is spinning really fast, well, this button pops out and pushes against this lever, and this is what pulls the throttle back to reduce the engine speed. Now, it may be a bit more complicated than that, but that's the basics. So what we're going to do is remove this gear, and we're going to cut this part of the governor shaft off. That way, we'll eliminate a lot of the moving parts, and we can still use the governor shaft as a pivot point for the throttle linkage. You see, with this spoon appendage cut off, we don't have to fabricate a completely new throttle linkage, which is definitely a bonus. So this is not necessarily a tutorial on modifying the governor on a 670cc engine. However, after watching a few other YouTube videos, I believe we capture some details others don't show. The governor shaft can now be removed from the engine block, and more often than not, there's another washer that will stick to the engine block and won't come out with the shaft, so you have to fish that out with your fingers. So this shaft wants to be cut right about here, and that's what we're going to do. A little cleanup takes the burrs off the shaft, and it's ready to be put back in the engine. This is the washer I mentioned earlier and tends to stick to the engine block. Obviously, we retrieved it, now it can go back on the shaft like so. And there we go. The shaft is back in the engine and the throttle linkage remains totally functional. Let's take a look at the rest of the governor. So this little gear thingy has to be removed. Now, most people use brute force and rip this gear apart with pliers and whatnot, and that works, but it can also take a long time to nibble away at this gear. So the fastest way to remove it is to punch the gear shaft out of the engine cover. And that's pretty quick. Now, that introduces another problem, and that is now we have a hole in the cover. So the common practice is not to pound the shaft back into the case. Instead, the hole can be tapped for a 1/4x20 bolt to block off the opening. And of course, Loctite should be applied to the bolt threads. But before we do anything, let's vacuum up any metal that may have gotten into the case by the threading process. And then we give the cover a shot of brake parts cleaner to remove any oil that may have gotten onto the threads. Now a bit of Loctite on the bolt, and then we can screw it into the cover. At this point, we can now reassemble the engine. So let's get that brand new gasket we have. So this is the brand new gasket that I bought in the event we damaged the old gasket, and it doesn't fit. So this is every YouTuber's nightmare. You see, videos are made on a nearly impossible deadline, and there's no time for mistakes. Something like this is devastating and pretty much shuts down the whole process. So a new gasket was ordered. However, there was no chance this video was going to be finished in time. Unless we got creative. So look, the car's running and driving, and all is well. Even sounds good too. Now, some of you are thinking, Jimbo, that's just a toy car on a treadmill. You can't fool us. Well, it was worth a shot. Okay, if you paid attention to the title on this video, it says episode 24 and 25. And that's because we couldn't finish episode 24 for obvious reasons. Anyway, while we waited for the new gasket to arrive, we went ahead and fabricated an additional support bearing for the input shaft, and that brings us to a total of 3 bearings to support this shaft. Now, one of the reasons we didn't do this right away is it makes changing the CVT belt infinitely harder, but through some clever engineering, we were able to make this bearing easily removable to allow for some semi-easy belt changes. So on this carbureted 670cc engine, we're going to try something different when tuning the carburetor, and that is we're going to use this wideband air fuel gauge to monitor the mixture. This rig is something I built many years ago, and it's more or less a self-contained portable wideband system. All it needs is 12 volts and of course a place in the exhaust system to screw this sensor in. Anyway, it's nothing special, it's just an AEM wideband kit with a few enclosures for terminal blocks and whatnot. I reckon this kit will take some of the guesswork out of tuning the carburetor. Well, to a certain extent. You see, the air-fuel mixture that works on automotive engines doesn't exactly work well on an air-cooled industrial engine. And from my experience, these little air-cooled engines run stronger when you run them on the rich side. Anyway, that's my method of tuning. You're free to tune your air-cooled engine any way you want, but in the end you'll find they like a little extra fuel. So after a few days, the correct gasket arrived and we started the process of putting the car back together. This side cover uses a handful of bolts that hold it into position. Now, 2 of these bolts are actually longer than the rest, and the longer bolts go here. Since the side cover is part of the engine block, the bolts should be torqued to spec, and that ensures the block isn't stressed by over-torquing the bolts. Eventually, we reached the point where the engine could go back in the car. Now, this engine cradle doesn't weigh very much, but it's awkward to handle, and using an engine hoist is a bit overkill. However, it certainly makes things a lot easier, especially when bolting the cradle to the transmission. So with the cradle in place, we had one more thing to fix, and that's the transmission side mounts that are located here and here. These mounts don't really do much as far as holding the transmission up, and it seems like the broken ones actually worked fine. But I'm told that these mounts help transfer the load from the swing arm suspension to the car's subframe, or something like that. Brand new mounts are still available for €130 a pair, and well, that seems reasonable, I guess, but instead of replacing the mounts, we decided to rebuild the mounts and save a few bucks or euros if that's your thing. Anyway, it turns out that the motor mounts from a 1963 Triumph TR4 are the right thickness and are only $8 a pop from Moss Motors. And with a few minor modifications, they'll actually fit fine. Well, good enough for a Predator-powered 1969 Renault. The only permanent modification we had to do was drill a clearance hole in the frame bracket, but who cares if the car's not 100% original, right? Fast forward a few hours and the engine's back in the car and ready to be started. But before we do that, let's take a look at a few things. Over here you can see the exhaust system's been wrapped with titanium cloth, and I'll tell you, this stuff is nasty to work with. It has to be soaked in water and installed wet, which ain't so bad. But there are sharp thingies in this wrap that poke into your skin, and they're impossible to see to remove with tweezers. Anyway, if you're looking to wrap your exhaust anytime soon, wear a pair of rubber gloves for sure. Now, since we're running the wideband sensor, we really need to be able to charge the battery, so I went ahead and finished the alternator wiring. And here's the best part. I watched one of my old videos on how to wire a 20 amp alternator, but truth be told, all you really need to do is look at the video thumbnail. It has the complete schematic right there. Okay, well that's the 10-cent tour. Let's go ahead and start the engine and see if we can find some new problems. Well, it runs, but it sounds like it's running lean when I goose the throttle. So the idle on this engine is a lot higher than what you'd expect on something like a Harley engine, and there's a reason for that. You see, there's a compression relief mechanism on this engine to help the starter crank the engine over, and that compression relief mechanism will cause the engine to stall if the idle is set too low. So unfortunately, we won't get that iconic Harley sound at idle. Let's take a look at that air fuel meter. The mixture looks okay at idle. Let's see what happens when I rev the engine. Yeah, it's running a little bit lean, but it's good enough for now. Let's see how the clutch works this time around. Wow, she grabs pretty good. Unfortunately, I still haven't fixed reverse, so let's try this again with the car pointed in a better direction. In first gear, the car launches hard and it's as smooth as butter. So it looks like the issue with the clutch chatter has been solved. Now, the only problem with first gear is, well, you pretty much have to shift into second gear right away, which is normal on a normal car, but this ain't a normal car, and we really don't need first gear, if that makes any sense. Whoops, I missed a gear. There we go. I'm kinda old school, and I like big blocks. There's nothing like a 396 and an M21 4-speed for that classic raw American power. Now, this car, well, it ain't got none of that, but it feels raw and it feels powerful, so I'm really digging it. So now I'm keeping an eye on the air-fuel mixture, and it's kinda in the neighborhood, but remember earlier in the video, I mentioned that the 2-barrel carburetor on this engine's tuned differently for each cylinder. So even though we're seeing reasonable numbers, it may be that one cylinder's running rich and the other one's running lean. It's hard to say. At some point, we'll have to dig into the carburetor and balance out the jets. Now this is kind of a stupid question, but has anybody noticed the car's extremely loud? Yeah, I kind of figured it would be, being it doesn't have a muffler of any kind. Now I'm thinking we're gonna have to put a muffler on it, perhaps something from a sport bike, and that should take the bark out of this exhaust sound. Anyway, the car feels a lot faster, and to be on the safe side, I'm holding back on the throttle, so don't worry, this car's a lot faster than what you're seeing on video. Just for giggles, let's do a 0 to 55 acceleration run, and the time to beat today is 51 seconds. Now, keep in mind we haven't done any carburetor tuning yet, and without a tachometer, I'm not going to push it too hard. I just want to get an idea of what's going on because the car feels faster, and perhaps we may be able to see a difference in the way the car accelerates. If you're new to the channel, welcome aboard. So obviously the car has been modified with a 2-cylinder lawnmower engine, and on top of that we're running both a CVT type torque converter and a 4-speed manual transmission. The CVT type torque converter multiplies the engine's torque, and if we put the transmission in third gear, well, mathematically with the CVT, it's equivalent to putting the transmission into first gear. It's all in the math and the way the CVT works. So today we ain't gonna start off in third gear, although we could. Anyway, we're gonna start off in second gear and let the CVT do all the work to about 30 miles per hour. Then we'll start shifting the transmission. Now, if you want to know why we're using a CVT instead of a regular clutch, well, we covered that in Season 3, Episode 18, but the short story is the engine can't handle the thrust loads a conventional clutch would put on the crankshaft. Check out Episode 18 if you want to learn more. So once again, the time to beat is 51 seconds. Let's do this. Not too shabby. We shaved 12 seconds off the 0 to 55. Now let's see how long it takes for this thing to get to 60 miles per hour. Alright, good or bad, it doesn't really matter. Keep in mind, this is an 1,800-pound car with a lawnmower engine, and it got to 60 in less than a day. We can definitely improve on that for sure. Let's head back to the workshop. Okay, just for fun, let's take this corner in fourth gear and let the CVT drive do all the work. So not so great, but it did do it. Also keep in mind, I'm holding back on the throttle because I really need a tachometer to get an idea where the RPMs are at. Now I do have a tachometer back at the shop, and it's one of those cheapo tachs made for lawnmower engines. They work okay, but since the engine's about 6 feet from the dashboard of this car, I have to extend the wires, and I'm not sure how that'll affect the tachometer. It should work, but you never know. So before I can fiddle around with the carburetor jets, I need to figure out what muffler we're going to use on this car. Now on these small engines, the muffler will directly affect what size jets I need to use in the carburetor, so it's best to figure out the exhaust before we start modifying the carburetor. Anyway, I have a few sport bike type mufflers on order and they should arrive by tomorrow. But this video has to be uploaded tomorrow. I reckon we had some fun today and the car is back on the road. Now keep in mind, I held back on the throttle and we still managed to shave 12 seconds off the 0 to 55 time, which is outstanding. Even though the car's faster, well, it ain't fast, but it's fun to drive. If you're not subscribed already, please consider subscribing. It's free and it makes a big difference in what projects we can do. Now, this 670cc Predator powered Renault is far from being done and I feel it needs to go faster. How much faster? Well, tune in next time and find out. Thanks for watching, and until next time.